Okay, good morning again. My name is Katie Dunker. I'm the statewide coordinator for the Master Gardener program. Excited to have everyone on today to discuss cold hardy cacti and succulents. Tony Koski is our presenter today, and most of you know Tony. He's been in the Extension Turf Specialist and a professor at CSU since 1988. He teaches turf grass management and advises turf management students in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture. As an extension specialist, he works with all facets of Colorado's professional turf management industry, including golf course industry, sports turf, professional lawn care, and sod production. His research interests include landscape water management, weed control, turf fertility, and soil management. He's received both his master's and PhD degrees from The Ohio State University. And I always mention this whenever I introduce Tony. He has also served as a volunteer master gardener in Larimer County since 2011. So he's not just a professor at the university and an extension specialist. He is also a master gardener actively volunteering. And I believe you do most of the farmers market outreach, and that's kind of your project that you manage. So he's 5 days a week at the university and Saturdays in Larimer County running the farmers market as a master gardener. So Tony, I would love to hear before you get started, where does cold hardy cacti and succulents fit into turf grass specialist work? How did you get turned on to this topic?
Yeah, it seems like a very off-the-wall thing for a turf specialist. So the way I got into this was actually, I was visiting a golf course in Denver and had lunch with the superintendent. And he started telling me how he converted his entire backyard to a cactus garden. And this is because he'd found some interesting cactus growing in the native areas around his golf course. And he started reading about them and he got interested in them. And so he took some home and he just kind of got hooked on these cactus. And like most turf people, we have horrible lawns. It's the last thing we want to do when we go home is take care of a lawn. So I don't have a lawn at my house. And he got rid of his backyard after his kids got old enough they didn't need a place to play. So I went over to his house and I thought, wow, this is cool. And he says, hey, just take some of these home and show. So he just broke a punty of pads off and dug up some things and threw them in a box. And I took them home and I planted them. And then I started collecting and reading and doing that type of thing. So I kind of got hooked on it too. So it was another turf nerd got me into doing this. And it fit well for my landscape because I don't irrigate anything at my house except my vegetable garden. So yeah, so what I'm going to show you is stuff really from my own garden. These things, they've never been irrigated. And this garden's probably, 12 years old now, and I've never irrigated anything. Maybe the day I plant something, I'll put some water on them, and that's about it. There's no irrigation ever. So it's just kind of a different thing for me to talk about and to do. And so I do tomatoes and I do winter hardy cactus at my house. So
Two things that couldn't be more opposite.
That's right. That's right.
That's great. Well, thanks for being here. We're all looking forward to this.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for listening in and watching, and hopefully you won't be disappointed. This is not house plants, although cacti can be house plants too. So, but what I'm going to talk about is using these outdoors as a part of your landscape. And again, as I just mentioned, these things have to be tough at my house because there's no irrigation, there's no fertilization. I've never fertilized any of my cactus. It's pretty much they sink or swim. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk about kind of the management, just what I've learned about growing these things, what works and what doesn't, and I'm still learning. I'll show you the ones that have survived all these years of basically torture and almost neglect in my garden. So these are the ones that are pretty much foolproof, at least in my estimation. And then talk a little bit about where to get these plants if you want to start your own a collection and some resources for just learning about cactus and succulents and just hints on growing them and that type of thing. And I don't profess to be an expert. It's just something that I've just kind of picked up along the way. And so I thought I'd share some of those things with you, and a lot of pictures that I take of my cactus. So let's see. So one of the things I wanted to start talking about, and this is just kind of interesting, kind of botany, and master gardeners seem to be interested in botany, is just a little bit about these plants in general. And so I'm just going to show you kind of a line drawing. Some people like seeing line drawings of anatomy, but then also a real picture showing some of these things. So a lot of people think that these green parts of a cactus, especially like opuntias, they think those are leaves, and these are not leaves. Actually, there are very few leaves on succulents and cacti, unless you count the spines, which are modified leaves, actually. And if you want to read more about the kind of the interesting anatomy of cacti and succulents, there's all kinds of stuff on the internet. But yeah, these are not leaves; these are stems. So the green, fleshy part of an opuntia, of a barrel cactus, the green part is a stem, and that's where the photosynthesis occurs in cacti and succulents. It's not in leaves, and if there are leaves, they don't stay looking like leaves for very long. So, yeah, just a little bit about the anatomy. Cacti are succulents. So succulent is kind of an umbrella term, and that can include yuccas and aloes and all kinds of other very drought-resistant plants that hold a lot of water within their stems. But cacti separate themselves from the others in that they have these little, for lack of a better term, bumps. They're called areoles, and these areoles are where the spines come from. It's where branches can grow from. Actually, roots can grow from these. So if you take an opuntia pad and just lay it down on the soil, in your cactus garden, roots will form from those little areoles. So it's a way for these plants to reproduce when they get broken apart in the wilds, for example. You can imagine how these things get spread around by maybe grazing animals or whatever. They get stuck on them, they move them around, and then they get replanted, and that's where the roots come from. So flowers also arise from these areoles. So they do perform a very important function. And then something else that's specific to cacti, and if you ever get into managing these, it's not the spines that are so bad, and they can be really bad. Some of them are very straight ones, like on this opuntia. Some are curved like fish hooks, and they're particularly nasty. Some of them are kind of soft and bendy, and they don't stick you too much. But what's worse on many, many cacti are these little tiny hair-like things called glochids. And the glochids form on the areoles, and they're at the base of the spines. And these are, they're darn near invisible. And I'll have a little picture to show you of why they're so irritating. But they're almost worse than the spine. So when you're working with cacti, you learn very quickly to get some really good heavy-duty leather gloves, because if you use cloth ones, the glochids will work their way through the cloth, or the spines can get through the cloth. So some people like to use welding gloves. They're pretty heavy-duty, using tongs and medical instruments and all kind of tweezers. People use tweezers to move their cacti around. So you learn very quickly to, at all costs, to avoid the spines and more especially the glochids. So that's a little bit about the anatomy of the cactus. Here's a picture of my garden, just one picture. I was going to take one of what it looks like in the winter, but I got about 20 inches of snow at my house, and then drifts that are from the wind we had a few days ago, like 4 or 5 feet tall. So you can't even see anything in my garden. So this is a view, and this would be early spring, before flowering. You can see there's a random tulip in there. And I'm not sure how that got in there, but it blooms every year, remarkably, without any irrigation. But that's another story. But this just shows I built this wall. It's a south and west facing slope. It was nothing but bindweed and kochia and all kinds of weeds. And I decided to do something with it. So another thing that I like doing just for exercise and relaxation, I guess you would say, is I build dry rock walls all over my property. So I go to the farmers around me, and they pile all these rocks up from their fields. They come up every year with winter heaving, and they put these piles of rocks at the edges of their fields, and I go and get the rocks, and I build dry rock walls, no concrete or anything. So I built this terrace wall. I modified the soil, although my soil is fairly gravelly, and that's one thing about that I've learned about cacti, and especially cactus, is that you have to have really, really good drainage. In fact, the drainage can't be too good for these, and that's how they survive best. So if you're starting with a clay soil, certainly you do not want to put any kind of organic matter into that soil to help it retain water even more. And generally we don't recommend mixing sand into clay. What I would almost recommend is actually even kind of, I call it sand capping, and we do this in turf, is instead of trying to change the existing clay soil by adding sand to it, which is usually a recipe for making concrete, is we kind of bury that soil, that heavier soil, and we build a sandy soil on top of it. And that's kind of what I did in these beds, is I built up the terrace with very sandy, rocky, gravelly soil for the cactus to grow in, and then I mulch with gravel. So you don't want to use organic mulch with your cactus. Although opuntias are pretty hard to kill, some of the other cactus you can pretty easily kill them with kindness. So you don't want to be putting drip irrigation or anything like that in here. You don't need it. So maybe watering the day you plant a new plant would be about all you ever need to do, at least in my opinion. So the other advantage to this is it's a south and west facing slope, so it gets super, super hot in the summer. That's always a good thing for succulents. The only thing that I kind of see is sometimes problematic is that it also warms up pretty quickly in the spring, and some of the cacti start growing probably before they should. So some of my borderline things that I've tried, these are all pretty hardy to zone 4, I would say. But if you try planting zone 5 and 6 cacti, they might only live maybe a year or two. So I've lost a lot of stuff. And so these are reliably super winter hardy. Some of the things they kind of die back every winter, then they have to regrow. But most of what you see here is persisted in that 10, 11 years that they've been planted. So just some hints that just basically kind of repeating what I said is, the better draining the soil, the better. If it's just like horrible kind of rocky, gravelly stuff, that's going to work great. A very sandy soil is like perfect. If you have a really heavy clay, it's almost better if you kind of almost bury that clay and have a very porous surface. I think the key is to keep kind of the crown and where the roots and those stems come together, keep that as dry as possible, especially during the winter. So if it stays really wet during the winter, that seems to be when I lose my cactus. It can be wet in the summer. They'll tolerate wet in the summer, but it's when it's wet in the winter, it seems like that's kind of a killer for these plants. I never water my stuff. It might be if you have a super well-draining soil and you start seeing stress on some of your plants, and the ones that are going to be showing it will be the opuntias. They'll kind of get shrivelly. Maybe an occasional water. And if you really want to promote a lot of growth, you can water and fertilize them. So if you want to get those plants large, and some of the opuntias will get huge, they'll get 4, 5, 6 feet across if you kind of pamper them. Thing is I'd stop watering way before the end of summer, because otherwise you run the risk of stuff going into winter in a succulent state, and I think that's what's going to winter kill on those plants. I've never fertilized. I don't think you need to. About the only place I do fertilize, and I should say I do fertilize when I grow stuff in hypertufa. I make hypertufa containers to grow these. And so if you're in a hypertufa and you don't want to have an actual garden, a lot of these really small little winter hardy cactus are great for those hypertufas, but you do have to fertilize them in those containers, because you'll very quickly run out of any kind of nutrients in hypertufa. And again, the best mulch is gravel, and I like to use this kind of red-colored gravel. You can get this at any of the rock supply, soil supply places up and down the Front Range, or just about anywhere. But it comes in black, comes in gray, so depending on what color you like. But I just started using the red, and that's what I continue to use. But if you're going to mulch, and you should mulch, because you can get weeds pretty easily. There's not a lot of competition in a cactus garden, so you will get weeds, and especially where I live, a lot of stuff blows in. I get tons of cheatgrass want to come up, and I am a unapologetic user of glyphosate, of Roundup, in my cactus garden for weed control. It's efficient and it works, and it's very safe. So I use that for weed control. But the gravel is an essential mulch. So let's look at a few of the plants. I'm going to start off with opuntias. I've probably got more opuntias or prickly pear, and I'll use those terms interchangeably. This is a really unique genus, and depending on which book you read, whose books you read, which cactus botanist you follow, there's all kinds of species names, and there seems to be this constant renaming of species. These things hybridize readily in the wild. And then for people who like to develop new cacti, the opuntias are really fun to play with. Just the colors, the spine colors, the time of bloom. And all these cacti pretty much are going to be blooming in anywhere from very early spring to sometime early summer, and then the rest of the time you just have very cool spiny things to look at. But so breeders will cross kind of late blooming opuntias with early ones to get mid blooming, and the different colors and the different spine colors and that type of thing. So I wouldn't pay a lot of attention to the species. Later on, I'll tell you about some of the websites and the people that that grow these and sell them. They'll have them grouped according to species, but you may not see even some of the species names that I'm going to talk about because it seems like the names keep changing. So we'll stick with Opuntia. There are some subtle and sometimes not so subtle differences in the appearance, mainly the vegetative appearance of the Opuntias, but a lot of these grow natively in Colorado. I would not encourage you to go wild harvesting. You can get permits to go on, for example, on Bureau of Land Management land. You can get permits to harvest cacti. Sometimes you may know people that have large acreages, like up where I live. There are people that have hundreds and thousands of acres of rangeland, and they're more than happy for you to come and dig these up because they basically pose problems for grazing animals that might want to feed on them, or if they accidentally step on them. So most of the farmers and ranchers I know, they're happy that you take these from their land, but some of them are on public lands and in parks. They are rare species. They're protected species. So I would not encourage wild harvesting unless you have permits and permission to do this. But they are very easy to dig up and move, and they transplant really well and easily. So there's a lot of the stuff around that you might see while you're hiking in state and federal parks. But the neat thing about Opuntias in general is obviously the flowers. If you like pollinators just go nuts over these things. There's so much number one, pollen, and obviously there's probably a lot of nectar in there. But you see all kinds of different pollinators sharing the flowers, everything from little bee mimics and flies and actual bees. Interestingly, you don't see much in the way of actual honeybees using these, but it's the more the native pollinators, and there's probably a reason for that. But the flowers are fascinating. Just the spines, the colors, the patterns of the spines. Just the cactus seems to change subtly from one month to another. So even after the flowering, I would encourage you to go out and just keep looking at them. And the new growth looks different than the old growth, and really old growth gets very woody and it changes appearance. So lots of things happen in a cactus garden besides just the flowering in the early part of the year. Here's another species. You can see a little bit smaller flowers, but then greater density. So sometimes some of these, there'll be so many flowers open at once you can hardly see the actual plant itself. But just the range of colors within the species, everything from pinks to yellows to oranges, and everything in between is it's really neat to see. And another thing about many of the Opuntias is the color of the flower from when it's a bud, kind of pre-opened, and then when it opens, and by the time it matures, the colors change throughout that time. So you'll get multiple different colors of flowers on the same plant based on the age of the individual flowers, as you can see here. So just another example of when these flowers on this particular plant are in the bud stage, and when they open, they have kind of this peach salmon kind of color, and then by the time they're fully opened, and then they're starting to basically die and senesce, they're yellow golden color. So you get multiple colors on the same plant at the same time, which is really kind of a cool thing to see. Here's another one, another species. This one has really long spines. So again, the spine arrangement will differ on the species. Sometimes you'll just get like one single spine per aerial, and sometimes it'll be 2, and sometimes it'll be like 10. And I think this is, and again, I'm not a real taxonomist. I don't geek out on actual making sure they're all identified properly. These IDs I took from my buddy, who I got the plants from, and I trusted him because he really gets into making sure he knows which species. But again, these things hybridize, so I'm not sure how you can ever know for sure which species you totally have with these opuntias, and especially then if you start buying them or if you're finding them out in nature. But just some of the different colors. Some of them tend to be more yellow, and others are oranges, and others are pinks, and that type of thing. So here's a picture of a pollinator, and this is not a honeybee. And this is just one of the coolest things, is just to go out and look at the pollinators that come to a cactus garden during the flowering period, and that garden will just be totally, literally buzzing with all kinds of different pollinator types, and they share the flowers. And man, they come out of these, especially the prickly pear. The opuntias are incredible pollen producers, lots and lots and lots of stamens. So those insects come out and they're just like totally yellow, covered with pollen. But obviously there must be a good nectar source for them to be attracted so well to these flowers. This species, fragilis, this one, it's an interesting. You just touch this barely with, and this would be with a leather glove. You just barely touch it, and you'll have a branch and a bunch of the pads come off. It's literally, it's tough as nails plant, but it's also very fragile. It can be moved so easily. It transplants so very easily. It makes this a neat kind of a ground cover though too. So it spreads and it'll make a mat of very low growing pads. But this is one of the easiest ones to share with people. You just reach down with some tongs or a leather glove and just grab it, and a whole bunch of it comes up. And then all you do to plant it is you just throw it down somewhere, and that thing will root within about a month. You'll have roots, and this is without any kind of irrigation. It's pretty remarkable how easily this one spreads and can be propagated and shared with people. Not to show you the flowers, but it gets a lot of them. And again, you'll get this mat of yellow or pink flowers with this opuntia. Now, one of the things that's super, super common on the opuntias, and also many of the other cacti, but especially it seems like on the opuntias, are these things called glochids. And these things, I mean, you just kind of look at them and say, oh yeah, they look like little tiny spines. But I put a little electron micrograph here for you to see. And you can see why they're so incredibly annoying, because when they get into your skin, instead of being able to pull them out easily, they're very, very difficult to pull out. And what makes them worse is they actually work their way into your skin the more you touch them. And you can see why this is they have an actual backwards barbs along that entire larger barb. And they are really, really difficult. They're really, really annoying. For sure, you don't want to get these anywhere near your eyes. I'm not sure. Well, you know how this happens is you get them in gloves, and if you're wearing leather gloves and then you just, without thinking, brush your face or something with those gloves on, you're almost sure to get some glochids rubbing off. So really, really nasty. You know, from an evolutionary sense, probably the reason for glockids and spines is to keep animals from grazing on these. I have grown opuntias that have almost no spines. In fact, you can get spineless opuntias that are winter hardy. The problem is that rabbits and mice, and I'm sure other critters during the winter will just graze those right down to the ground. Obviously, the spines in these glockids are a protective feature to reduce grazing by critters in the wild. But you know, the spineless ones, they seem like a good idea, and you can buy them, but they, at least in my garden, they didn't last long. They get eaten by things, and it's because there's so much water, there's a lot of nutrients, there's a lot of sugar stored in those pads. So I think that's why these plants form these. As far as getting glockids out, there's all kinds of stuff on the internet from cactus growers and people that work with these. Everything from individual tweezers to using duct tape, putting Elmer's glue on it, letting it dry, and then peeling it off. Just basically rubbing your skin raw with a pumice stone and rubbing them out that way. You know, eventually they stop irritating you, but it can be quite annoying for a few days, depending on which part of your body you get these things on. So now a few things, I make these plants sound to be pretty much carefree, and in many ways they are. You don't have to water, you don't have to fertilize. You know, from that regard, they are carefree, but they are certainly not a pest-free plant in the garden. So I'm going to show you some of my, I won't say my favorite, but the more common insects that occur on my plants. And this is probably the most common one, this thing called the cactus bug. So you can see there's the adult, and these are true bugs. And so they have a piercing mouth part, and so they just stick their little mouth part, their stylet into the cactus pad there, and they just suck goodies out of that plant. And so they're getting water, they're getting nutrients. They're incredibly prolific, so they lay tons of eggs, and so they don't have a true metamorphosis. So they have all these different life stages, from very, very tiny little cactus bugs, and they go just through these different stages where they keep shedding their skins until they're a fully mature adult. But everything from the nymph up to the full adult, they cause damage, and they will kill opuntias if you get enough of them in there. And so the feeding itself causes kind of a disfiguring coloration. So all those little yellow spots are from the cactus bug feeding. But then, you know, I don't think this is a favorite plant for a plant pathologist to study. I'm sure there's some viral and bacterial diseases that occur on these plants that may be introduced by the feeding of these cactus bugs, as is what happens with many other horticultural plants. True bugs are very good vectors of viral diseases and bacterial diseases. So that may be accompanying the feeding of these, but certainly they can be a pretty darn severe problem. Something I would say, though, just to go back to these, is I do use insecticides, and as long as you do it at a time when the plant's not flowering, and that's a pretty short period of time during the year, just don't apply any kind of insecticides just prior to bud opening. and just wait till, all the fruit is formed, especially on the opuntias, and you're not going to harm any pollinators. But really, what works really good for these is imidacloprid, and acetamiprid also works well. So your garden insect controls, you can go out there with, jets of water, that knocks them off, but in my estimation, it doesn't. It's a very temporary thing, and not a very good control for these cactus bugs. So they are tough little buggers. Something else that's pretty darn common on the opuntias, but also occasionally you'll see it on a few barrel cactus, but really opuntias are the most common source, is this cochineal scale. And it's of just a very fuzzy white kind of a scale that you'll see on opuntias, and these will also kill opuntias if it gets severe enough, and they will get severe. So I encourage you to watch for these in your garden, and as soon as you see them on a pad, you can kind of do it like you do with house plants with scale. You can use some rubbing alcohol and get individual ones, just touching with a paintbrush or a cotton swab or something. But they can be really hard to get to, because a lot of times it's like they get right down, and you can see it in some of these pictures. They get where the areoles are, and sometimes I think they get down in there. But they will kill a plant. They'll just deplete it. They'll just run it out of resources. And so if you get a really severe infestation, if you don't pay attention to your garden for a while and they reproduce like crazy, I would just prune those pads out and throw them away, because it's a really hard thing to cure. But imidacloprid after blooming can provide some control, but only if it's a mild infestation. Otherwise, I would just remove those plants, or at least remove the pads. Something interesting, though, about this cochineal scale is that it was discovered hundreds of years ago to be a source for a red or crimson dye. And that's where dyes came from originally. They were all plant derived. Just naturally, there were very few sources of red or crimson or vermilion, whichever you want to, a word you want to use to describe this color. And early kind of Mesoamerican native folks found this growing on cactus down in Central America, Mexico, and that part of the world, and they used and collected these insects, and there's actually records of them being cultured, and you can see in this, I'm not sure where this drawing came from. It was sometime in the 1700s, that the cactus and the scale were intentionally cultivated so that they could produce and harvest essentially for this red dye, which was very, very color fast in clothing. So there are clothings and cloth samples from the 1600s and the 1700s that are as brilliant today as when they were produced back in that time. The color doesn't fade in cloth. Now, when it was used, the stuff was used in paint. It was used to, early artists would use this. And somehow, and for some reason, when it was put into paints, the color fades over time. So the other thing it was used for, kind of starting somewhat recently, was as a natural source of food coloration. So replacing the synthetic, red dye number 4 with natural red dyes. And this was This was done by food companies. Kind of an infamous or famous one was Starbucks started using this for some of their pink-colored, oh, I'll call them foo-foo drinks. I got my tea from Starbucks, but some of their pink-colored frosty, whatever they call those things, I can't remember. They used this stuff to color one of their pink drinks, and then it got out that the vegan folks that were buying these were horrified to find out that they were using crushed up insects basically to color their Starbucks drinks, and they protested, and then so Starbucks stopped using this, but totally natural. So kind of famously, the biggest user still today is Yoplait Yogurt uses this to color their pink-colored yogurts. So if you like eating insect blood and guts, there you go, get your Yoplait yogurt. And hopefully that didn't ruin breakfast for some of you. But if you really want to read an interesting book, here's a book that's totally about this whole cochineal, the dye, how the Spanish early on, when they came over, and the early Spanish explorers, and they discovered the source of this crimson red dye, they protected the secret. They wouldn't share it with the rest of the world, and they made quite a bit of money off of this dye before the secret got out. But there's a pretty interesting book there about all the murder and mayhem and espionage and everything that occurred simply because of this insect. So kind of interesting reading if you like entomology and botany and history all combined. Here's another insect. This one is a pretty tough one on cactus, mainly on opuntias, but if you're your barrel cactus, you'll get this one. And this one's a definite killer. The beetle does a little bit, the adult does a little bit of feeding, but it's really the eggs and the borers that destroy the plants. And they do destroy plants. They absolutely will kill and nuke very, very large prize specimen opuntias. So, and it's something that works again. Here's the thing: is getting an insecticide into the opuntias doesn't work real well. So you almost have to be looking for the beetles and hand picking them. You don't get a lot of them. So when you start scouting, this will get another good reason to go out in your garden. Basically, we're doing IPM. Is going out early in the morning. That's when it's easiest to see these beetles, or sometimes late in the afternoon, right before the sun sets. It's easier to see the beetles and get them before they start laying the eggs. But once the borers form inside, it's pretty hard to kill them. Prickly pears, of course, are great for eating, and those of you if you like nopales or nopalitos, and there's a bunch of different ways to eat these, but also the jams and jellies and syrups that you can make from the fruit. And some of these opuntias, the flowers are not that showy, but the fruit is incredibly showy, and they'll hold these fruit all winter. And so from a winter color perspective, you get some neat colors in the garden. But after flowering, when they go from green to these purples and red colors, the fruit sometimes look just as cool as the flowers do. The fruit is good. It's tasty. I don't know how to describe it. Some people say it kind of tastes like watermelon. It does have kind of a watermelon taste to it. Here's a problem: is there's always glochids, sometimes spines on the fruit. And so you have to find a way of dealing with those. And some people like to peel these. I started doing this, but then as I read, especially foodies that use these, really what you want is the juice from these. There's lots and lots of seeds in these. There's glochids, there's spines, there's the skin, which is tough. So there are better ways of dealing with these, and really probably the best way in my mind to process the fruit is just to harvest them, maybe wash them if there's any, just spray them to get any kind of dust and soil off of them, and then just put them in a blender and macerate them, or a food processor, or maybe boil them and then blend them. Some people like to freeze them and then blend them. Just freezing them overnight kind of softens them up a little bit. Basically, you make a bunch of mush. I know that's a technical term. And then you strain it through cloth. So an old pillowcase or a t-shirt, cheesecloth lets glockets through. So you don't want that. But through a true like cotton cloth that'll trap all the nasty stuff, and you just let it drain, and that way you get nice clean juice, and then you can use that for making your jams or your jellies or your syrup, or your drinks, or whatever kind of concoction you want to make with these. So you can just strain them like this, and then you can make little cubes of the Opuntia juice, and then you can use it for whatever you want to use it for, or use it immediately to make your jam or your jelly or your syrup with it. So so that's how I would process them. I wouldn't bother with the peeling and all the other stuff that sometimes you see on the internet. The Nepalese, basically this is where you're eating the pads. And again, you still have to deal with the spines. You have to deal with the glochids. So some people like to burn them off using propane torches, and that can work pretty well. Others, I've grilled these, and grilling can work. And it's not just the spines. It's also, there's infamously the slime that comes with when you start cooking with Nepalese. Just simply cutting them open, and it seems like the more you wash them, the slimier they get. It really doesn't affect the taste, but there's kind of a textural thing. So if texture bothers you with some foods, the sliminess of these can bother you. The taste is, I think they kind of taste like green beans myself, kind of almost lemony, if you will, green beans. Snap beans is kind of what they taste like to me, but super healthy for you. So some ways of getting rid of the slime. One way is to actually to boil them for quite a while, and you can see the slime on the lower left-hand picture. That's the slime on the surface, that frothy stuff. So some people just like to cook and skim the slime. It kind of rises to the top. Some other ways of dealing with it is just overly boiling them, and eventually the slime just goes away. Grilling them, the slime kind of drips and seeps out onto the grill, and into the charcoal, and that's one way to de-slime. Slicing and dicing and baking for about 30 minutes to 375, the slime disappears. Sauteing them, eventually it looks really slimy when you're sauteing. Then some weird chemical reaction, all of a sudden, boom, the slime just disappears if you do it long enough. So you just have to be patient. Eventually the slime disappears, but it's kind of that raw, eating them raw, maybe in a salad sometimes you get a little bit of the slimy thing. But if that doesn't bother you, then that's good. And also dehydrating them. You can dehydrate these pretty well. So if you're in the dehydrating, like your tomatoes and that type of thing, these dehydrate pretty well, although you got to cut them pretty fine, and they do hold a lot of water because that's what cactus do. So that also de-slimes them. This is just an interesting bit of horticultural trivia. Luther Burbank, he had the idea of developing a spineless cactus, and he chose Opuntias to do this. And he was fascinated from childhood, if you read about this, with cacti. And he had a pet cactus when he was like 6 years old, and that, some people say that's what got him interested in horticulture. But in any case, he introduced more than 60 varieties of spineless cactus, and he thought this was a plant that could revolutionize farming in the Southwest, where there was no or very little water for irrigation, and that you could grow these out in the desert, and that you could have cattle foraging on these instead of on irrigated crops. And so the idea was, if you had a spineless cactus, the cattle would eat these. And that part was true. The problem is a lot of other things in the wild ate those. And so, again, losing the spines made them vulnerable to all kinds of other grazing wild creatures, and they would eat these spineless cactus. Here's probably the most interesting thing, though, is that he did a lot of breeding. Luther Burbank was obviously the Burbank potato. Originated with him, but also many plum varieties that we still eat today were developed by Luther Burbank. But interestingly, when he looked at the time he spent with different crops, and he spent a lot of time with crops, he estimated about 60% of his life's research time was spent developing spineless cactus. And then the next largest amount was with the plums, and everything else was after that. So he was huge into the development of a spineless cactus. He never truly developed one that was truly spineless, but there are some that are out there pretty close. And if you want to try growing opuntias just for the food, for the Nepalis, just go on to Amazon, get some of the spineless pads, fresh pads. And I've done this. They are not winter hardy, but you can grow them as container plants. And I've got some that are 10 years old that I just bring in during the winter and put them outside in the summer. And I actually plant some in my garden. They grow like weeds, literally. And you can harvest those. But again, they're not winter hardy. And you can get truly spineless, but not winter hardy opuntias. Just buy them like you're going to buy them for using for food preparation. Then plant those pads that you get from Amazon, and they'll grow like weeds. Some other cool plants, Hoyas. These are native in southern Colorado. They're kind of borderline hardy. Certain species will tolerate a little bit more cold than others. And again, in my garden, it's very, very open. They have horrible spines. You do not want to plant these where kids or visitors are going to be, unless you want to keep kids and visitors away, then you do this. But they are used in certain parts of the Southwest as living fences. They're impenetrable because of the spines. But cool flowers, but it's mainly really the cool architecture of the plant. And they'll get pretty tall. I've had some get to be like 6 feet tall. You can see a couple of them in my garden there. So, but the tops in my garden often winter kill, and they have to regrow through the rest of the summer. This is one of my favorite ones, Whipple's Hoya. This one is a variety. It's often sold as one called snow leopard. It gets very white spines. And they are dagger-like. These things will slice you like you wouldn't believe. But they're incredibly beautiful, especially when you get the sun setting behind these. They get brilliant white. It's just a really cool look. And I can't remember if I have a picture in here. There's kind of a picture of what they look like when the sun is setting behind them. Just striking plants. And sometimes the spines will have a little pink color to them before they turn it, or after they've been around for a while and they age. But you can see why it's got this name, snow leopard. But a very painful plant to have an encounter with, but a very, very winter hardy one, by the way. Here's some other cool ones. This is a fairly common one. This is native, again, to this part of the country, claret cups. A very cool plant, gets brilliant red flowers, very winter hardy. and there's a lot of different varieties out there. The claret cups can do well in hypertufas. So there's some pictures of them growing there, not just getting ready to flower. And then we got some really cool ball cacti that are very, very winter hardy. These are really tiny little guys, but they make some really neat little colonies, and they're good for filling in spaces around rocks and that type of thing, and get just gorgeous gorgeous flowers. These things need perfect drainage though to survive. So you really want to make sure they have drainage, and you definitely don't want to water these things, but really cool flowers. Here's another one, mountain ball cactus. So this you can find in the mountains. Look at this, hardy to zone 2. So these are, if you're in a very severe climate and you want a cactus, this is one that will survive really the coldest of the cold. And sometimes it gets so covered with flowers you can't actually see the actual cactus itself. Here's another one, really cute little one, Simpson's PDO cactus. It just got really cool looking flowers. And actually I picked my gravel actually to match or to complement the flowers on this. So that's why I picked the gravel color. It's one of my favorite cactus. It's super hardy. It's kind of a foolproof one, but really tiny little plants, about the size of a golf ball. Here's a really cool one, really neat looking flowers, very almost tropical looking flowers, and then it gets these cool little red fruit that stay on that plant for a long time until mice find them. Mice like those, and if they can get in amongst the spines, they'll pull those fruit out and eat them. But this one's native throughout the Great Plains, but another one that really needs good drainage. So that's the truth for most of these little ball cactuses. You need really, really good drainage. Here's one called hedgehog cactus. And so these cactus, they reproduce by these little side shoots. So this is a good one for sharing with people. You can just break these little side shoots off, side branches off, and give them to people. And all they got to do is stick them down in the soil. They're going to root, and nothing really fancy you have to do with these. But again, kind of cool colored flowers. And when you get down close to these, they do smell very lemony in the spring. These little ball cactus are great plants to put in hypertufas, and you can put them in with semps and any kind of other succulents that you might want to grow along with them. Here's one called lace cactus. Really cool looking spines, and you can touch this one without getting any spines or glochids. So it's a cool one to have if you got kids. Super, super hardy, and gets covered with these really striking flowers. So it's a beautiful ball type cactus. And just a close up of this one. Here's one. This is an interesting one because this is a plant that's in its natural habitat, is an endangered species. But when people have collected it and then cultured it in nurseries, it's super, super easy to grow in a nursery situation. So it's a very inexpensive plant to purchase online. But ironically, in its native habitat, it's endangered. So kind of a victory of sorts, if you will, of the horticulture and the green industry and collectors, is that in a way this one's been saved from extinction by collecting. Not that I would not encourage you to find it this way. You can get it very easily on the internet and from growers. I'll show you in a minute. But a really cool looking little cactus, but again, needs really, really good drainage. And here's just another picture of it, and it just makes these tiny little cool looking fuzzy bumpy globs of stems. So it's a beautiful little plant and super, super hardy. Here's another one in a container. So it does really, really well in containers. Oop, I showed you this one already. That one snuck in there. So now I've just been talking about cacti, and just for time, I'm just going to mention yuccas can be a lot of fun to grow. This is my favorite one. You can get this one from High Country Gardens. It's kind of, I wouldn't call it a variegated one, but it gets these white edges on the leaves, and it gets these little frilly ends on the leaves. And it's a very compact one. You need great drainage, and it's hard to come by. The only place I've seen it sold is High Country Gardens, but this thing just grows so well, and it's beautiful. It's just a striking little yucca. But there are all kinds of yuccas out there, as you can imagine, and there are all kinds of native ones, which most range people consider to be weeds. But there's some pretty cool ones out there. There's this is the one people are probably more familiar with, is the Texas red yucca, which you can also get from High Country Gardens. So not a lot of varieties in the yuccas. There are some interesting ones that some of the companies sell, the nurseries sell, but these are probably the two most reliable ones and coolest looking ones. And another group of plants that I would encourage you to try are the agaves. And I think people see these and they're kind of shocked when they see them in my garden, although a lot of mine have died because they're kind of borderline winter hardy where I am at. The three species that I think are most winter hardy are the ones I've listed there, but I've had quite a bit of winter kill with mine. And it's because I've gotten down to like 25 below zero a few times at my house, and that seems to wipe them out. But really amazing plants. These things can be brutal though, spine-wise. So if you have them growing anywhere near where people are walking, you can trim the spines off with nippers, and I would encourage, at least at the ends of the pads. But and they do form pups, side shoots, and sometimes they do flower, which is kind of uncommon, but once they flower, they die. That's another interesting things about agaves. So I would encourage you to try these and look at some of the companies that are selling them. You can get small ones for a pretty good price and try them and see if they survive in your garden. So where do you get these if you want to start this? These are probably the three best ones, best sources, and I'll just kind of show you some screenshots from these. But one that's local, and a lot of people have heard of Kelly Grummins. He's like a cactus and succulent expert, and he propagates these and he grows them, and so he's got this internet site, and you can actually go visit him and buy them in person too. He's got agaves and yuccas, as well as all the different types of cactus, and incredibly inexpensive too. He's got the fairest prices. Here's just a screenshot of one of his pages, and you can see $6 for a rooted cactus. So he can sell pads and he can sell cactus, but all these sites are very clear if you're buying a rooted plant versus just buying a pad that will have to root. But you can see there he's got a yucca, a very cool one for $15, and some of the opuntias for 10. And so great website. He's got lots of information on how to grow these, different hardiness zones. He's got them broken out all kinds of different ways. His favorites, which ones he thinks are most reliable. Got them divided by flower color, just all kinds of different ways to look up the different plants. And again, the price is incredibly reasonable. Here's a source in Utah where I've gotten some plants. And again, just really interesting stuff, super winter hardy stuff. They've got super winter hardy agaves and yuccas that they specialize in growing. So really good source of plants, very reasonably priced. High Country Gardens is a pretty good source too. Not as many plants as the first two, but it's a pretty good site. And they've got a lot of information on gardening with these, and so how to prepare the soil and everything I've talked about earlier. So good sources of information there. And then here's one in Idaho, Geoscape Desert Nurseries. Really cool plants, lots of different opuntias, but also other succulents, agaves, and yuccas and other plants. And they also do some interesting, very drought and cold hardy perennials too, mainly for rock gardening kind of situations, but also lots of information on just how to cultivate these and keep them alive. So those are some sources, and then there's lots of good books, and I won't talk about each of these books, but here's one on different types of succulents, and some of these are natives, and a lot of them are introduced ones. But it's a really cool book, and by a local author. Then just some really other good books that specifically talk about cacti and succulents for cold places. Here's another one by a local author's husband and wife team. This one's kind of hard to find, but this one was written for growing winter hardy cactus where it's wet. So people in the Midwest and either the East, I think the author of this is from Michigan. So people try growing these cacti everywhere, and it's really hard to grow them in places where it rains a lot. So talk about needing very good drainage. As far as societies, Colorado Cactus and Succulent Society is a good place to go for information. They have plant sales, and they have a calendar of events. I took this screenshot from their website. They're updating their website, but they also have a Facebook page. So, and they're very active, and lots of cool stuff on their website. Here's one just about opuntias, basically. It's called Opuntia Web. So if you really want to get into opuntias, I mean, this is where you can geek out on opuntias. And then this Cactus and Succulent Society, this is the Western Slope. So if you've been over to Grand Junction at the extension office in Grand Junction, they have one of their gardens there. And so the master gardeners over there take care of this garden. It's a spectacular place to go in the spring and early summer to see the flowering, but also just to see the variety of plants. But they have a absolutely fantastic website, so much information, newsletters, just to really, if you want to find out anything about growing these plants and where to buy them, they've got other sources that I haven't listed here, nurseries around Colorado that might sell a few. Just a great website. So with that, I'd like to take any kind of questions anyone might have, and want to thank you for listening, and hope you might try at least a few of these in your garden. They're pretty fascinating, and I think you get hooked on them after you've planted a few.
All right, thanks, Tony. So let's go ahead and get to some of the questions. There were at least 2 that came in from one person. But if any of you have questions, go ahead and use the chat box right now. And then after I ask this first question, I'll go ahead and open up so you can unmute your line and ask questions live. So this year, with the very early super cold weather, a master gardener had their hedgehog cacti look shriveled and have some purple discoloration. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a real, and I should have put pictures in. Actually, that's what I wanted to do, but I couldn't dig through all the snow. Is when during the winter, and you're like in shock after you've had your first summer of these cactus, and then you don't look at them in the winter. You'll think you've lost everything. They turn purple and brown, and they shrivel up, and you'd swear they are dead. And by spring, it's like nothing's going to come back. And they do. Those pads just kind of rehydrate. Yeah, you do get winter kill sometimes, and some of them don't grow back, but it's remarkable how they change. And that's just another one of those seasonal things with these, is that they just change from one month to the next. As slowly as cactus grow, they seem to change personality. But yeah, they can look pretty darn scarily ugly in late winter and spring especially.
But that shriveling, that is how the plant protects itself from winter
Exactly,
freeze.
yeah. So when plants acclimate, any of our plants, trees, perennials, turf, anything, that acclimation process going into winter, the plant has to dehydrate itself. So it loses water, it increases, just to be nerdy, the osmolality. It increases the solutes and sugars and salts in its cells, and that lowers the freezing point. It's like the plant creates its own antifreeze, essentially. But in doing that, the plant shrinks and shrivels up and looks really, really ugly.
Do you leave your hypertuphas with cacti out in the winter?
I shelter them. I kind of put them by the side of the house, and so they're out of the wind. And I will check those for moisture during the winter. Yeah. So yeah, they're more prone to drying. I mean, hypertuphas are prone to drying out. That's what makes them grow succulents so well. As they dry out, the drainage is perfect if you put the right, potting media in there. But yeah, I do protect those a little bit in the winter.
All right, here's another question. What's the best way to start a large outdoor cactus garden? What kind of soil, for example, would you use? And I think you answered this a bit in your presentation, but.
Yeah. I'd start small just to learn how to grow these things before you go out and buy lots and lots of plants, because you'll learn a lot the first few years. But I would start smaller and really make sure that soil drains well. And so here's the thing: is if you've got a really clay soil, either bury it with like 6 inches of a very sandy soil that you buy, or get sand and incorporate it. But you have to incorporate. Now, see, if you go to some of these websites, and this is where I'll disagree with even like a Kelly Grummins, I think he says add like 50 or 60% sand. I would say 80 or 90%, because just from a soil physics perspective, you need to get to be 80 to 90 before you change the drainage of like a clay soil. That's a lot of sand to add. And so that's why I say it's almost makes more sense to cap that heavy clay soil with a draining soil, and then mulch, then plant your plants in it, and then mulch with gravel on top of that. So you build drainage on top of poor drainage, and then just don't water it. Okay. So, and you'll find those roots will grow through that sand into the underlying soil. So the roots will grow into that clay. The key is keeping kind of that crown area dry. That's the really important part if you've got heavy soil. So you may not even have to build it up 6 inches, just a couple inches, so that crown is kind of elevated above that heavier soil.
So a follow-up to that was, how deep do you modify soil if you're going for 80 to 90% sand?
Yeah, I would say, if you can modify, so here you go. If you put 6 inches of sand on and till it 2 inches deep, that's how you're getting to your 80-90% sand. So that's the weird thing about changing clay with sand, is you have to put so much on and that not really incorporate it that deeply. So that's why I say it's easier to build that soil rather than on top than to create it from tillage. And it's so hard to till that much stuff in uniformly.
All right, another question about transplanting. How do you recommend transplanting and staying safe, with the spines?
Yeah, just, gloves. You can use pruners to cut if you want to cut some of the branches off, especially really woody ones. And something that I think works well, and this is what I tell people when I just give them pads, I just put them in a cardboard box, and I say, just let these set like in a garage or somewhere for 2 or 3 days, and just resist the temptation to plant them. And then what happens is that wherever you cut it or you broke it off, that it kind of calluses over, it dries up. And then just dig like a little slit in where you want them to grow and stick the end of that pad into the soil. Or it sounds crazy, just lay it on where you want it. Just lay it on the soil, and it'll start rooting from those areoles. So they're super easy to transplant. But some people like to root the pads in a little container full of very good draining media, and get them rooted. And that's when you buy, like from Kelly Grumman's, he's going to sell you rooted pads, or he's going to sell you ball cactus that has a root system on it. But it's taken him 1 to 2 growing seasons to get it to that point, so he can sell it in a container. So, but yeah, they are easy to propagate, and it's just using gloves and tongs and just things to keep yourself away from those spines.
So it's tempting this time of year to want to purchase some of these plants, especially after a talk like this, right?
Yeah.
But when is the ideal time to plant these and consider purchasing and getting
You
going?
can plant them. Yeah, plant them starting in the spring, anytime during the summer. I think you'd want to make sure they were rooted. So I probably wouldn't be planting these like in August, even if you buy container ones. That may not be enough time for them to really get established before the first winter. So I would say, yeah.
So it's like it's like most plants in Colorado, we want to consider planting after the last frost, excuse me.
Yeah. April, May, June, into July, I think is a good time to be planting these. Yep.
But if we wanted to get going early, some of these could be purchased and propagated indoors this winter.
Yeah, you can keep them. Yeah, keep them in a sun porch or someplace bright. And if you buy the containerized ones, yep. Yeah. A lot of the places, they won't sell them to you now. They don't want to ship them now or whatever, and it's just, I think they're afraid people are going to put them in the ground and they're going to die, and they want them to get them replaced. So some of these sites I showed you, you go to their website, it says closed for the winter, or we start shipping in March or something like that. So,
yep, shipping temperatures too are a concern. And then I just had a question about elevation considerations. So obviously, this is a statewide webinar. We've got folks joining in from all over the place. Other than zones, are there considerations with some of the plants that you mentioned about elevation?
Yeah, I would choose those microclimates, and I think anyone that's at elevation, they find those little places, that south or west facing location where they can get some heat and that type of thing. Certainly, you don't want to plant them on the north where these things basically full sun is what they need. And so if you're not full sun, or at least 3/4 sun during the day, it's probably not a good place to be putting these. So you're talking south or west facing location at elevation, and then just choose the ones that are super hardy, like that mountain ball cactus. I mean, that thing, it could probably grow in Rocky Mountain National. Probably does. I can't remember seeing any up there, but it will grow at incredibly high elevation. So you just have to be more selective with your plants. And I would say anything that grows up, like Hoyas, that grows way up at elevation, they're probably not going to do well. They're going to winter kill so far down to the base that they'll spend the whole next year trying to regrow. So I think the Hoyas are better for lower elevations.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, but people are free to unmute themselves and ask questions if you have them. I did want to mention that some folks listed a few sites where you can go and check out some cold hardy cacti. There's the gardens on Spring Creek. have installed a cold hardy cacti garden that was curated by the horticulturalist and author Laura Springer Ogden. Tony mentioned the Mesa County CSU Extension Office. They have a beautiful cacti garden. And Denver Botanic Gardens they have a great array of plants there too, where you can go check out some of the
They
cold
have
hardy
some
cacti.
really interesting succulents, and they do a lot of containers, hypertufa and stuff with cactus too. So
yeah, they have some agaves and yuccas that are
yep, they got
just
some really tall right at
breathtaking.
the entrance.
Yeah,
They've got some really cool looking plants and that's a very protected place. So those aren't going to grow for most people, but DBG's got kind of an interesting microclimate there for some of the stuff.
they certainly do. So I've listed the evaluation for this webinar. Please take a moment to copy that into a browser or click on it and complete the evaluation. That's always helpful. And if there's no other questions, we'll hang out for a few more minutes, but if there's no other questions, then we'll plan to see you in the new year in January for houseplants. And we've got a bunch of webinars lined up. I have them scheduled through May, so we're really excited for another season bringing these webinars to you all across the state. Any other questions? Now's your chance. Otherwise, we'll just hang on for a few minutes and see everybody in the new year. I am going to post this recording on CMG Online as well as the PDF of Tony's presentation, so that if you missed writing down some of those plant names, you'll be able to get all of that information. Or if you're really interested in cooking cacti, you can get all that information from the presentation. That was kind of a nice bonus, Tony. That was cool.
Yeah, and send me an email if you have any other questions you think about, or even next year your cactus is doing weird things. I'm not a total expert, but I might be able to answer some of the questions.
Yeah, I appreciate you putting yourself out there on a topic that is not your typical topic. So it's great. All right, a big thanks to Tony, and thanks everyone for joining in. We had about 61 people on. So awesome.
Cool.
For a Monday
Thanks,
morning
everyone.
after a holiday weekend, that's pretty great.
Pretty great.
Thanks, everyone.